Hello, everyone. This is Danny Joseph here from your Not Your General History podcast. I'm debuting the very first episode of this podcast, and I've chosen to go with a segment called Buttons to Bios. I hope that Buttons to Bios will become a long running segment, and of course, it will be mostly dedicated to biographies. Today's episode is going to be about Empress Elisabeth of Austria, who is more usually known as Sissy. I will be speaking of a few books and a few paintings through this podcast, and I will link to them at the description below. So, about Sissy today, many people know her as Sissy because of the 1950s trilogy with the well known actress Romy Schneider and Karl-Heinz Bohm. However, Karl-Heinz Bohm, but whenever you look into her life a little more, you start to realize that there is practically nothing of the film character that matches the actual historical character. So Romy Schneider's Sissy is very sweet and very bright and basically looks nothing like the real life Elizabeth at all. So if you do any quick research, it's really easy to find very basic details about her life. She was a Christmas Eve baby. She was born on the 24th of December 1837 and she died on the 10th of September 1898, so we're almost there, at the age of 60 in Geneva, Switzerland. I will leave the story of her death and her murder to another time, but it's widely known that she was murdered by a man called Luigi Lucchini, and that the circumstance in which she died may have somehow contributed to construct the whole mythology around Elizabeth and Sissy and whatnot. So there is this ongoing fascination around Sissy. It's been long lasting, and it's funny because she's one of the few 19th century figures that actually managed to enter our own pop culture. And although this is a niche, she's there and she's very present. Aside from the very well known Sissy trilogy, there are at least two cartoons which are, let's say, very loosely based on her life. The oldest being a French Canadian series, which aired during the 90s. It was a really sweet, charming series. I really loved it when I was a child. And I remember they had lots of merchandise and sissy dolls with sissy dresses, and it was the best thing in the world. But then it's one of those cases in which you just grow up and you realize that the real deal was very, very different. And this actually begins by her physical appearance. The cartoon Sissy has honey blonde hair, light blue eyes, and many sleeveless looking dresses that look like a debutante's. But then if you look at real life Elizabeth's pictures and paintings, it couldn't be more different. Their only shared similarities are that unbelievably small waist, which Elizabeth did have, and being quite tall. Because if you actually look at the paintings, they will show you that the real life Elizabeth had brown amberish eyes. It's kind of difficult to tell, but they were definitely not blue. And a hair that varied in color. I'll cover that later, but it's never honey blonde. If you ever have the chance to actually go to Vienna, you will realize that the city's tourism very much lives and breathes Elizabeth, which is kind of ironic because she never really liked Vienna at all. You have something called the Sissy Museum, which is part of the Hofburg Palace that you can visit and should visit. It's not very big, but it's very interesting, and you'll see a bit more about her life and that amazing replica of the Hungarian coronation dress, several of her best known paintings, and overall bits and pieces of the long and short of her life. I remember visiting, and there's a statue there. It's a white statue of Elizabeth, and it's really, really beautiful, remarkable. And I remember that the first time I was there, well, the only time I was there was a lady in front of me, and I heard that lady whisper, "Wow, she was so beautiful," and that lady was in awe. And well, yeah, Elizabeth was known for her beauty. And yes, the statue is absolutely astonishing, but there's something that is kind of important to realize, and I will try to explore that a bit later in another podcast when I start talking about her beauty rituals. That's not a statue made from life. I have a strong feeling that many of her depictions from the late 19th century until our days are very much designed to beautify her. I mean, she did refuse to take any more pictures after a certain age. She was beautiful, but what I want to say here is it's practically impossible that Elizabeth ever posed for that statue in her life for a very simple reason. As I said, she was born in 1837, and that statue clearly depicts a young woman in what is, at the very earliest, a late 19th century gown. So it's not likely, and I don't like to say the word impossible, but it's not likely that Elizabeth looked like a 20-year-old woman in the 1890s when that dress would have been en vogue. They basically created composite pieces of art in which they took old representations of Elizabeth in her youth and adapted them to the modern, well, modern for them, new styles and dresses. Be careful with your sissy depictions if they look like they were made especially after 1870. Well, just the same, Viennese tourism is Elizabeth. I think that at least 80% of the merchandise is about Elizabeth, and it's really good. It has lovely merchandise, it's very classy. I want to bring it all home, but it's all very much based on that sad, beautiful, charismatic Empress idea. And if you want to know more about the real life Elizabeth, there's really not that much. And I think that she's fascinating enough on her own without that whole beauty myth, so I wanted to know more. And when I'm looking into historical figures, what I like to do is check the sources for that time period. But in this case, it's kind of difficult because I do not read and I do not speak German or Hungarian. She did speak both. Most of the time, and unfortunately for me, I have to rely on translations and secondary sources. I think that probably the most well known biography is Brigitte Hammond's The Reluctant Empress from the 1980s. There are a few others. I haven't really picked them up much yet, but I did enjoy Hammond's book. And yet I find there is so little about Sissy's childhood and Sissy's early life. There's a clear effort by Hammond to make it known to us, but there isn't really much that we can get directly aside from very generic statements about her father and her parents' marriage and her love for Possenhofen. But I want to say this is not at all Brigitte Hammond's fault. When we're dealing with recent pieces, and yeah, the 19th century seems so long ago, but in historical terms it's actually very recent. It's quite difficult to find the material because there's so much that's still stuck in private archives, private households. And as a matter of fact, I've even seen some auctions of Elizabeth's letters. For instance, if you go to the Dorotheum website, it's a museum in Vienna, you can find some of her letters up for auction. And thus I'm sure there's a lot more material that may or may not come out in the following years, but it's still not that easy to reach it. There's probably another problem going on, and I think that the other problem is that people did not really care all that much for Elizabeth until she turned 15. And of course, got engaged to the emperor. Of course, I'm not saying that her family did not love her, that she didn't have people who cared or friends or whatnot, but she was, another normal person. And I'm not saying she became abnormal after being Empress of Austria. What I'm saying here is that that's something you can see in Hammond's biography in the first few chapters. It was her older sister who was the pride and joy of the family. She was the beauty. She was meant to marry the Emperor Franz Josef, not Sissy, as many people very well know. That part of Romy Schneider's story is actually correct. Anyway, Elizabeth was just another child. She may or may not have married a king or a prince. She may or may not have done something really, really cool. We don't know what would have happened. But, the world turns around ifs. But she was not very, very relevant for family politics during her early childhood, and they were there, at least for her mother's plans regarding Austria. If you go looking for period material, you'll find something really interesting, which is that there was a biography published just after she died. She died in 1898, as I've said, and then in 1899 you immediately get a memoir, and it was published in London and Philadelphia, so it was published outside of Austria. It's written in English, and it even has the little added subtitle with 80 illustrations. So I think this kind of comes to show a little bit of the popularity that she already had. And the fun part is that I've just been complaining about the lack of access to material, but the author, the first thing he says, a man named Edward Albert de Burgh, says that he had so much material that he had to, and I'm quoting, sift through it and only select what was authentic. The person who wrote this memoir actually didn't meet Elizabeth. I didn't find many information about him yet. I'm trying to dig into that. I think it's interesting because at least he would have known a bit about her character. But, it probably creates some bias towards what he calls the illustrious lady. And besides, he knew her for 30 years and she died at 61. So that's basically just a little after that historical circumstance known as Hungarian coronation. And I'm going to cover that later, but it was the circumstance in which Elizabeth and her husband were crowned as King and Queen of Hungary, and that kind of consolidates her status. So he didn't know her in her childhood. The Burgh, and hopefully the Burgh is unrelated to Jane Austen's Lady Catherine de Bourgh. I'm kidding. I'm sorry. Says that he is publishing pictures which are not public, and that he got special permission to publish that. It's on his page 8. And it's probably one of the first written sources to say that Elizabeth disliked being photographed in her later years. That kind of explains what I've been saying before, that her paintings and her statues are definitely not taken from life in her later years. But anyway, what does this man, a man who knew Elizabeth in her full bloom and followed her path to the end of her life, what does he say about her childhood? He was Elizabeth before Franz Joseph. We know, first of all, that she is a Bavarian princess. Well, whether she can actually be called princess, I'll have to investigate a little bit more. Don't get me wrong for explaining where Bavaria is, by the way. I know that most people probably do know where Bavaria is and whatnot, but I've seen lots of cases in my life where people struggled with geography and with 19th century geography, because it's talking about countries that don't exist anymore, at least not as independent entities. So I'll just quickly say that Bavaria currently belongs to the south of Germany, and it has a southern border with Austria, and it has an eastern border with modern day Czech Republic. I don't know if I pronounced this right. I'm so sorry. Elizabeth, title-wise, what I can say is that she was born as an Herzogin, which translates as a duchess. So Elizabeth is definitely not a Cinderella story. It's not a rags to riches. She was born to aristocracy. She was born into nobility. And she was not born into just any nobility, but she was the daughter of a royal princess and the granddaughter of a king. Her mother, Princess Ludovica, was one of the many, many daughters of King Maximilian and Queen Caroline. And when Ludovica was 20, she married her cousin Maximilian Joseph. And if you read Hammond's book, and any quick internet research will confirm this to you, Ludovica made what is probably the most modest marriage of all her sisters. 3 of her sisters went on to become queens, and one of her sisters goes on to be an archduchess. And then you have Maximilian. Maximilian was also 20. He was exactly the same age as Ludovica when they got married, and his immediate background was a bit more modest, but just because he was not an immediate relative of reigning royals, that doesn't mean he wasn't a big deal. He was descended from a cadet branch, and a cadet branch, for those who don't know it, is like a branch that descends from any son that is not the first son. He belonged to the house of Wittelsbach, and his father was a duke. His paternal grandfather was also a duke, and his paternal great grandfather was a Count Palatine. So, I mean, he's not a king, he's not an archduke, but, he's still a noble, and all his ancestors were noble, and so on and so forth. So, Elizabeth was born a little duchess in a household which is just beginning to grow. She's the second daughter born, and there's a funny little contradiction about her birth because the book says on his page 26 that being born on Christmas Eve was considered an ill omen. And then you see Hammond on her page 33, and she says that her family, Elizabeth's family, believed that she was, and I'm quoting here, one of Fortune's darlings, exactly because she was born on Christmas Eve and on a Sunday and with a tooth, which was apparently called a lucky tooth in Bavaria. So I'm kind of wondering how much of Elizabeth's recent death may or may not have influenced the Burke's writing that being born on Christmas Eve was not lucky. And here begin our issues. There's basically nothing else said about her childhood. The book says that her first journey was to Bad Ischl at the age of 15, that very fatidic journey in which she met the emperor and whatnot. But Hamann looked into the letters of her mother Ludovica, and she figured that when she was trying to find Sissy a husband, Elizabeth would have gone to Dresden in early 1853, which is the same year as the Bad Ischl journey, but it does raises a few questions. Did she leave Bavaria? Did she not leave Bavaria? She had aunts in several European kingdoms, so did she go to them? Did they ever meet? She surely did not spend her entire childhood in the same place, because she must have gone between Possenhofen and Munich. She was born in Munich, sorry to anyone German listening my foul pronunciation, but she was born there in her father's palace, the Herzog Max Palais. Herzog Max Palais? I don't know. There's actually description of this palace's plant in an 1829 book by Leo von Klenze, who was a famous architect, and he was at the court of Ludwig I of Bavaria and whatnot. The building itself still exists, and although I've never been to Munich, it seems that it has a little commemorative plaque, and that it now belongs to the Deutsche Bundesbank, and this would be on Ludwigstrasse 13. So if you live nearby, or if you're passing by on your holidays and whatnot, check it out. If you look at some really, really old illustrations of the palace, you can see that, of course, the city landscape has changed a little bit, and that now it seems there are a lot more buildings all around, and that the streets grew a bit narrower because of sidewalks and the roads. The truth is that what is truly, completely, and absolutely different is the Munich Palace and Possenhofen. In Munich, you have a very classical, geometrical looking palace with Greek lines, with columns. It's basically a box-shaped city building. It has a direct connection to the street. There are buildings all around. And then you have Possenhofen, which is nowadays a very pale building with a very different outlook. And it has very white walls, very neat windows, and there are gardens and trees and nature overall. The distance between Munich and Possenhofen is not that great. What I usually do when I'm trying to get a rough idea of how long it would take is to use Google Maps and see how long a bicycle ride takes. I mean, it's not very accurate because, roads are not half as good in the 19th century, and carriages would be transporting more weight, but it's still a little over 30 kilometers, and it takes about 2 hours on a bike. So it's very likely that the family could travel between Munich and Possenhofen on the same day. And Possenhofen has a lake and lots of landscape, but you can question what did it look like back when Elizabeth lived there? And that's a bit debatable because if you look at the 1852 Karl von Polte painting, which is linked below, you'll see the background and it looks like quite a few things have changed, especially garden wise. It seems like in Elizabeth's day it would have kind of a lot of tropical species, and there are also some signs of what looks like degradation, which are not there anymore. You can see clambering plants that don't seem to be there, but I've just seen it in pictures. I haven't seen it in person. And the house looks like it's a soft beige instead of the pure white it has now. It also seems like there are some paths that we don't have there anymore, and the view towards the lake looks a bit more unobstructed from where Elizabeth was painted. Those battlements that you see today were not there at all. There's the link to the painting, as I said in the description, if you want to check it out. The only thing that does seem quite similar is that the window shutters kept their shade of green, but that's about it. Sissy's Possenhofen looks a lot more unkempt back in her time, and yet it kind of looks charming, very mingled with nature, and definitely very different from what she had back in Munich. If she woke up in Munich, she would hear the sounds of carriages and horses and street merchants and what was probably a very busy city life. But if she woke up in Possenhofen, she would hear birds and fountains and nature overall. And it seems that through her life, she very much preferred the latter. There's still another painting of Possenhofen, also linked in the description below, and I really recommend looking at the difference in color and landscape between today's version of the castle and the 19th century one. And I also advise you to look at the difference between Possenhofen and the 19th century illustration of the Munich palace. Well, anyway, with this, we already know that Sissy lived between two very different worlds. We know of her parents' aristocratic origins, we know where she was born, we also know that she was officially Christian Catholic, because that will play its part when she marries the Emperor of Austria. Although, Hamann, if you open her page 9, if you have the book, Hamann quotes her mother as stating that she and others of the royal household were Protestantized growing up, which really makes sense, because when you notice it, Sissy's grandfather, Maximilian Joseph, reigned during the secularization of Bavaria and Protestants were emancipating. And yes, this is Wikipedia data. Another detail which I think should be kept in mind is that Ludovica and Max had been married for 9 years when Sissy was born. Ludovica had her first child 3 years into her marriage. She married on September 9th, 1828, and her first child was a son named Ludwig, who was born on the 21st June 1831. Then a brother followed, who died only a few months after, and curiously he was born on the 24th December like Sissy in 1832. Then you have Helena in 1834. And when Sissy comes to this world, she has a 6-year-old brother and a 3-year-old sister. And although child mortality was unfortunately insanely high back then, people's affections are a whole other deal, and we don't know exactly how the death of baby Wilhelm would have affected either parent. Then you have her next sibling, Karl Theodor, in 1839, when Sissy was only 2, and then Marie Sophie was born in 1841, when Sissy was 4. So she has at least 3 siblings very close in age, Marie Sophie, Karl Theodor, and Helene. She continues to have more brothers and sisters until she turns 12. She has Mathilde Ludovica in 1842, then Maximilian, a stillborn, in 1845. Sophie Charlotte in 1847, and the last baby, Maximilian Emmanuel, in 1849. So if you notice it, Sissy was practically in her teens when her last baby brother came, and her oldest brother was already 18. But this was quite normal, and you can find it in many families of that day and age. If you look into Queen Victoria's family, for instance, her last baby was born when her oldest daughter was about 17-ish. I'd have to confirm. There's a lot of talk about what her mother and father were like, but there's not much at all about her education. I've been trying to dig into some books, those other biographies I spoke about, One of those is Jennifer Bowers Banny's Stealing Sissy Star. It's a bit of a different register, and it has some notes based on Joan Haslip's The Lonely Empress. Now, this latest one I still have not been able to pick up, and I really want to, because Banny quotes Haslip as saying that Sissy would have loved to comb her hair but hate trying on dresses, and that she was, and I'm quoting directly, fidgety, and that she didn't focus on her schoolwork and had to be tied down to a chair by her tutors, that she would have preferred playing with dogs and horses. And this last bit of information, now based on Andrew Sinclair's Death by Fame, A Life of Elisabeth, Empress of Austria. It states that her father apparently told her that if they were not who they were, they would be in a circus. To that, Bainey also adds that Sissy would have learned how to do tricks on horseback, acrobatics, and how to play the harp, the piano, the zither, and the mandolin. Now, there's actually pictures of her playing the mandolin in Madeira, so at least the latest one seems confirmable. The reason I want to read Haslip and Sinclair's books is that I really want to know the sources they used for their statements, because sometimes some myths are perpetuated, like that whole Marie Antoinette stance on let them have cake. Probably never happened. But there are parts of it that kind of ring true to Sissy in her later life, like her obsession with her hair and her love for dogs and horses. I'll let you know when I've had a chance to pick this up and see where they got it from. Out of all this, we basically know that Sissy liked to be outside and that she really liked horses. That's really not that much, but there's a couple of things that we know of what would have happened in her home, both in family life and education. Some authors, including Hamann, had access to something called the Corti Papers, which according to Cannon's book, a book called The Decline of Bismarck's European Order, Franco-Russian Relations, 1875 to 1890, sorry, it's a really long quote, but it's worth it. His page 107 has a note, and it says that the Corti Papers are the writings of Count Luigi Corti, and that they were delivered to the Bulgarian National Museum in the 1920s. According to these papers, Maximilian studied history and natural history at the University of Munich, following a few years in the academy in the same city, and he would have traveled extensively. The year after Elizabeth was born, for instance, he would have left for Egypt and Palestine and brought a series of antiquities to his father's house at Banz Abbey, north of Bavaria. So it must have taken him at least over a month to get there, even if he went by ferry, plus the travels themselves, plus the return. He wrote a book in 1839 and the book was published. It's linked in the description below. We don't know much, but we do know that Ludovica was left alone with a newborn baby, a 3 or 4-year-old daughter, and a 7-year-old son. The marriage is acknowledged by biographers as being unhappy, and there is the often quoted statement by Ludovica, as seen for instance in Hamann's page 9, of when one is married, one feels so abandoned. It's also said though that Max did start being nice to Ludovica after 50 years of marriage, which is not very useful. Anyway, he would have told Ludovica outright that he did not love her when they got married, so that surely was a lot to deal with. We know that many princesses did not marry for love back then, but Hamann's quote of Ludovica spending her first anniversary crying says something about her personal sensitivity, and it makes one wonder what went on behind the curtains of their house that we just don't know. It's really interesting because Ludovica and Max have one of the most beautiful engagement pictures I've ever seen, aside from a very creepy looking dog. They look like a charming, remarkably handsome couple. It would be really interesting for a body language expert to analyze it. I know it's all staged, but it would be. They're both looking away from each other, although in the same direction. There's some idea of movement. Kind of looks like Max is moving away from Ludovica. I don't know if it's a coincidence or if it goes beyond that. So back to Hamann's page 9. She says that Max Joseph later had something called an Artusrunde, a gathering of scholars and artists who were mostly middle class, that his palace at the Ludwigstrasse had a café chantant, a ballroom in the circus, that he loved folk music and women, and that he very much enjoyed his routine. And this routine was marked by dining with his illegitimate daughters at noon. I did try to find information on these girls, but I saw nothing so far. I don't know who they were, who their mothers were, how they made their way into the household. I would not say they lived there. I never saw any reference to it. It would be a big scandal, but it's not impossible. But most likely someone had to go and pick them up. But if this was a daily event, where were they? I don't know if these women married. I don't know if Maximilian contributed to their lives in any way. I don't know if they had any living descendants, and I would love to find out. I also don't know their age, whether they were younger or older, and that would be interesting because we don't know if Sissy and her siblings had any contact with them whatsoever. Probably not, but it would be interesting to know what they knew or didn't know about them. It would take some digging, though, into Sissy and her family's letters, those things of difficult access, to understand if there are any memoirs. So, anyway, after this huge digression, I think I'm going to call it an end here because I think this segment is getting a bit long. I'm definitely going to continue into Sissy's life and her story. And I do know this episode didn't have that much about Sissy herself, but considering the information that we do have right now, I think that the best way to approach her is through these representations of her family and their lives. Next episode, we'll continue through her childhood and into her teens, and I'm going to try and pick up a few major events between 1837 and 1853 to see how the turns of that fast-changing century may or may not have influenced her, what she would have seen in the papers, the new devices, etc. I hope you all enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun making this, so as the Romans would say, salvete to you all.